Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in more layers of turbulence, intersecting turbulent flows every year, it seems. We have the climate change. We're still dealing with the pandemic. It's not called a pandemic anymore, but it's now endemic. There are other risks like that down the line, and we have a geopolitical stress. There's still war, Congo, and of course Ukraine. The Gaza situation is marginally resolved for the moment, and we have a new administration in the United States that is tasked with being turbulent. That's sort of the ultimate layer of turbulence right now in this country, and it's spilling over into others through trade policy and the like. One thing that's constant is the need for innovation around the issues that I focus on Sustain What, which are how do we build a better relationship with climate and energy? How do we preserve biodiversity while humans flourish at the same time? How do we develop preparedness for disasters of all kinds? And how do we avoid information pollution taking over our conversations? And so it's great to be here today with Tom Kalil, who pretty much in parallel to my experience in journalism had experience in public service, particularly in the White House of two presidents dating back from the early 90s, Clinton and Obama. He's gone on more recently to advise wealthy individuals and organizations on how to shape their strategies for making a difference in the world. Where do you avoid opportunity costs? Where do you put money where it can do something that's really going to have a good chance of making lives better? And now this past year, he launched a new project. It's called Renaissance Philanthropy, and you'll learn about it just as I will learn about it. I've been on the website and seen some of the briefings that are online, and I'll let Tom lay out the details and the philosophy and the mission. But I just want to kind of get started by going back 4 or 5 centuries. One of the themes on your website and just the whole idea, the name of your organization is Renaissance, and it goes back to the idea that in the 500 years ago, 400 years ago, wealthy individuals, the Medici family and others, spurred some of the greatest innovations in sort of the European part of the human experience. Da Vinci, Galileo, so much. And that was direct funding and support of different kinds by rich people for innovators and artists. So, Tom, let's just start briefly with your definition of, or your conception that there can be a new Renaissance and or the need for it in this 21st century.
Yeah, so I think that there are 3 things that are useful to keep in mind with respect to a number of these challenges that we face. And maybe one good example is you have on this slide the child survival revolution. So if we had the same level of under 5 child mortality that we had in 1800, the number of kids under the age of 5 who die every year would be 50 million. And instead, it's not 50 million, it's 5 million. If the entire world were like Sweden, that number would not be 5 million, it would be 500,000.
Wow.
So 3 things are true simultaneously. One is things have gotten much better. We have reduced the rate of under 5 child mortality by a factor of 10. But it's not the type of thing that we focus on because we tend to focus on the news, a plane crash in Washington, D.C.,
right?
Not slow, gradual progress. So things have gotten much better. They've improved by an order of magnitude. We still have big problems, right? No one could look at a figure like 5 million kids dying every year, largely of preventable causes, and saying that we should be content with that. And things could be much better still. That is, there's room for another order of magnitude of improvement. So I think that's a useful way to think about many challenges. Is and sometimes we have a tendency to just focus on one of those, when I think it's often the case that all three are true.
And it clearly with something like child survival, science has played a huge role, and of course,
Yes.
access to the gifts of science. It's not just science itself, but how it moves into the public sphere through medication, through healthcare availability, and the like. And so I guess there we start to talk about, it's not a thing, right? You know, vaccine is one thing, but you could have turmoil around its utility, and policy
Sure.
can go in one direction or the other. So if you're sitting on a pile of let's say $1 billion you want to expend through the course of an institution or individual's remaining years, how much do you focus on which parts of the system? The actual thing, the vaccine, or the information environment that allows it to spread, or yeah. So when you start to talk to people about the how to be efficient and effective,
Yes.
is that the starting point?
Well, I believe that there's at least 4 different types of things that philanthropists could do with their wealth, um, particularly once they've identified a challenge or an opportunity that they're excited about addressing. One is that they can engage in grant making. So they could say, I'm going to give you a grant or a gift, in the same way that the Rockefeller Foundation played a very important role in helping with the Green Revolution. Um, the second is they could invest in a firm, but with much more of a long-term orientation. Um, so the philanthropists who are participating in something like Breakthrough Energy Ventures,
Right.
they are investing in climate and energy related startups, not necessarily because they think this is the way that they're going to make the most money possible, but because they think that solving the climate problem is going to require that someone be willing to invest in companies that are highly capital intensive and may take a long time before they develop something, as opposed to investing in software startups that VCs are very attracted to. The third thing they can do is to advocate for policy change. And the fourth thing that they can do, depending on who they are, is they may have a certain ability to convene for problems that require coalitions, as opposed to problems that are only going to be solved by an individual researcher or a single nonprofit organization.
And you were doing some of this in the preceding years leading up to this new venture. How would you describe what it is? Is it a consultancy, a hub, all of the above?
Yeah, so I would say that what we're trying to do is to help philanthropists who particularly know those that want to get started, to identify high impact projects that are aligned with their philanthropic priorities. And that in some cases can take the form of advice, but we are also running programs on behalf of philanthropists and foundations, sometimes on behalf of a single philanthropist, other times on behalf of a coalition of philanthropists and foundations. And another thing that we're trying to do is to contribute to the discussion about how philanthropy can have an outsized impact. So to get started on that, we published our first round of playbooks. These are 6 playbooks that talk about different approaches to solving problems that we believe are underutilized and that more philanthropists and foundations should know about and use when it makes sense.
Okay. And how do is there are there a lot of people? I know there's a lot of rich people on this planet. There are some who don't seem very focused on this arena. Um, is any of this about outreach to people to think more about how to be effective? You described the longer timeline on investments, which is different than donating to X.
Yes.
So are you trying to sort of spread the gospel about to people who might not even be thinking this way?
I think it's more that they're interested in doing something. But I think you have philanthropists who are still professionally active, and they have no immediate interest in doing what Bill Gates did, which is he stepped down from his CEO role,
Right.
and devoted full time to building an organization of 2,000 professionals that
Right.
is charged with taking his wealth and turning it into advances in global health and global development. So there are other people who are still getting a lot of satisfaction out of their day job, and so have less time to devote to the question of all the things that I could do in the world with my wealth. What should I do, and how would I do that?
Right.
And so what we're very interested in doing is meeting them where they are, finding out what they care about, and then say, well, if these are some people and ideas and problems and approaches to problem solving that we have come across, that we think are potentially transformational and where philanthropy can have a large but-for impact. The superpower of philanthropy is its flexibility. The ability to do things that neither the private sector is doing, nor is the government.
Right.
If you are interested in biomedical research, at least if I were a philanthropist interested in biomedical research, and I knew that the NIH had $47 billion, I wouldn't necessarily be interested in supporting a project that they are highly likely to fund. What
Right.
I would be interested in knowing is what are the types of ideas that, for structural reasons, the NIH is less likely to fund, but if they were successful, would have this, large but-for impact.
Right. So
Or alternatively, not funding a project that any, venture capitalist who invests in the life sciences would be willing to support.
right. So we're going to dig in more on some of the methodologies and some of the examples you mentioned in a couple of minutes. But let's do a little time traveling now and go back to your roots.
Yes.
You wrote this piece, 100 Examples of Putting Science in Its Rightful Place, back in terms of public,
Yes.
the OSTP. So just
Yes.
tell people a little bit about your learning journey and how that relates to what you're working on now, like
Yeah.
gap filling.
So I was very privileged to be able to work in the White House for two presidents, President Clinton and President Obama. For President Clinton, I worked for the National Economic Council, which was responsible for coordinating domestic and international economic policy. And for President Obama, I worked for both the National Economic Council and OSTP. And my boss was that Dr. John Holdren, who, as you know, has been a real leader in energy, climate, and arms control and national security issues. And in these jobs, you work very hard. We used to joke Friday means only 2 more working days till Monday. But at least my experience was that over time, it gave me this very strong sense of agency. And the reason for that is we had the ability to send the President of the United States a decision memo and to have him check the box that said yes. So the following sequence of events would occur. Someone would give me a really good idea. I would then vet and evaluate that idea by talking to other subject matter experts and stakeholders, assuming that I still thought it was worth bringing to the attention of the president. I would see if this is something that the president wanted to support. If he liked the idea, he might talk about it in the State of the Union. And then in a relatively short period of time, there might be a hotel full of people working on it. And if that happens enough times, you begin to develop the sense that there are more things in the world that are at least potentially changeable because they're the result of human action or inaction, as opposed to the second law of thermodynamics, which we really can't do anything about. And so that's why it was so rewarding. It's that I would be reading the paper and it would say, the following thing is true. And I might say, boy, I bet that if I devoted enough time and energy to working on this, there's some non-zero chance that I could do something about it that would hopefully be, on balance, constructive. And it was, I really enjoyed it. Obviously by the standards of the private sector, the pay is not great. The hours are long. You can get caught up in partisan fights. So I'm not saying like every day was a holiday there, but what I am saying is that I found it personally very rewarding, the opportunity to work for two presidents.
I can imagine. And one of the things that would be a challenge always is presidential terms are shorter than the cycles in which most big breakthroughs both emerge and get dispensed into society. So how do you fit it into the politics of needing to get reelected and the like?
It's a great question. I was fortunate in the sense that a lot of the things that I worked on were less inherently partisan. Right. So one of the things that I worked on for President Clinton was a speech he gave at Caltech in January 2000, in which he announced something called the National Nanotechnology Initiative. Newt Gingrich was a big fan of this. There was, when I left, there was actually bipartisan legislation, and it has resulted in over $40 billion in federal investment in nanoscale science and engineering. And there are companies that are beginning to develop products like better energy storage that are based on 3D graphene, which is a form of nanotechnology. So that's an example that's still going on, 25 years later, survived the transition from one president to the next multiple times. Similarly, for President Obama, I worked on something called the Brain Initiative, which aspires to do for neuroscience what the Genome Project did for genetics. President Obama announced that in 2013, and then Congress did something that they almost never do, which is as part of legislation called the 21st Century Cures Act, they provided 10 years of dedicated funding for the NIH component of the Brain Initiative. I was able to get DARPA and then ultimately every agency the ability to support incentive prizes for up to $50 million. If you go to challenge.gov, you'll see thousands of instances of agencies using this authority. And this was an area that had, strong bipartisan support. So there's this idea that political scientists talk about called the secret Congress, which is what are the areas where if MSNBC and Fox News are not talking about something, members of Congress on both sides of the aisle can work together.
I'm kind of muting in between because I'm at my mother-in-law's, as I said. She's just had some minor surgery and she's coming home momentarily and the dogs are barking. One good thing about challenge.gov is the website works. There's a lot of government websites right now that are not functioning because we're in transition between presidents. And I think it's worth asking you about your sense of what's coming and or, the best case picture. Is there, Congress has its own agendas and imperatives for supporting a lot of different science. We have a president who patently doesn't seem to respect science. pushing for a Health and Human Services secretary who still says Lyme disease was engineered. So, and we went through one round. So,
Yes.
Can you offer some insights or thoughts on what's really in danger, what strategies might work? And then we're going to dive back into Renaissance.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think one of the things that we saw last time around is that the proposals that the Trump administration put forward were not ultimately supported by the Congress. So they proposed deep cuts in the NIH budget. They proposed eliminating ARPA-E. They proposed deep cuts in the energy efficiency and renewables part of the Department of Energy. And not only did Congress prevent those cuts, they actually increased the budgets of those agencies. So our founding fathers came up with this great idea of checks and balances. And so I think, one of the things that we're going to see is, what ultimately happens. Obviously, there's some things that the administration can do through executive action, but some of the things that they want to do will require Congress acting. And what we saw, at least in terms of science funding, was that their proposals to provide deep cuts to budgets like the National Institutes of Health were, ultimately, not supported. I think, one question is that I think that there have been some mistakes that have been made, I would say, across the political spectrum. So I think, an example that I would give is there was originally this question about did COVID-19 have its origin as a lab leak? And there were scientists who wanted to use their position to say, oh, no one should even talk about that, right? And I certainly don't have any special insight into whether it was a lab leak or not. But I do think that there is a risk if scientists engage in activity that, with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, can be viewed as political, that will sort of undermine their credibility. In the same way that if people in the public health community say we should have a lockdown, but it's all right if you go out and protest structural racism, people are going to look at that and say, hey, are they just calling balls and strikes, or are they putting their thumb on the scale?
I just had to unmute. I think the dogs have settled down. Some of this, I guess, we're just going to have to see. It does seem like with Musk involved, who's built entire companies around science, that the budgetary wrangling could get tough. And some of that, I think, may play off of some of the issues that you just described, scientists who stepped a little bit beyond their bounds in trying to control the narrative around things like COVID. Unfortunately, if there's something that reporters of the public should be paying attention to going forward, knowing how this plays out through the past decades, what would some of that be? And then we're going to look at these strategies for helping wealthy people make a difference.
Yep. Would you like me to talk about some of them?
Oh, well, I was going to say just one more thing about this situation now. What should we be looking at going forward in terms, or, what should people call their Congress people about? If you're just thinking based on what's known about what happened the last time around and what's seems more strategically mature this time around.
Yeah, I mean, let me tell you something I'm concerned about, which is I think, and I don't view this as like a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. I think it is a bipartisan failure, not a partisan failure,
Mm-hmm.
which is that I think people were so sick of COVID that there seems to be very little interest in saying, how do we do better the next time? And we may be very close to having another pandemic. I certainly hope that we don't, but hope is not a strategy.
Right.
And I just think that there's a bunch of things that we're not doing that we should be doing in terms of, early detection of an avian flu, transmission, developing better diagnostics, developing vaccines, where people, politicians would just don't want to talk about it.
Right.
And I just think that that's irresponsible. So if I had an opportunity to buttonhole a member of Congress, that's probably the issue that is top of mind for me because of how many deaths it caused and how much economic dislocation it caused, and the learning loss was really terrible. And I just don't think it's responsible to say, well, I'd prefer not to talk about it.
Right. That sounds fair enough. But let's talk about Renaissance philanthropy one more time.
Yes.
So take us through some of the strategies and toolkits that you are working on that help people make better choices.
Yes. So let me talk about two of these ideas that are related to each other: market shaping and target product profiles. So there are lots of instances in which we need an innovation, but for some reason the private sector is not investing in it. And the canonical example of this is vaccines for diseases of the poor. So left to their own devices, drug companies don't work on vaccines for poor people because they have no money. So they would not be able to justify to their shareholders why they would do this. So economists like Michael Kramer and Rachel Glenister came up with a very clever hack for solving this problem, which is a purchase order for a product that doesn't exist yet. So as a result of their work, 5 countries and the Gates Foundation went to GSK and Pfizer and said, if you develop a vaccine which is safe and effective, we will provide a copay of X dollars per dose for Y million doses. And that one intervention saved the lives of 700,000 poor kids in developing countries. So my view is we should be doing more of that. The Trump administration did that as part of Operation Warp Speed. They went to Pfizer and Moderna and said, if you get an emergency use authorization from the FDA, which is a proxy for what it means for a vaccine to be safe and effective, then we will buy 300 million doses. So rather than subsidizing the R&D, what you're telling the private sector is, you make it and we'll buy it.
Okay.
So how is this playing out in climate? Well, the IPCC has said that probably we need to be doing on the order of 10 gigatons of permanent carbon removal by 2050 if we want to meet our 2050 goals.
Right.
And so Stripe said, well, if we need 10 gigatons, we better start out now so that we can drive down the cost through economies of scale and learning by doing, so that by the time we're having to do 10 gigatons a year, that we will have created a large industry. And since no governments were stepping up to the plate, Stripe, Meta, Alphabet, Shopify, and McKinsey, and Stripe's customers, made a collective commitment that they were going to purchase $1 billion worth of permanent carbon removal. And that effort is called Frontier Climate. And the reason that effort is so important, $1 billion is a drop in the bucket with what we would ultimately need to do.
Right.
But what it's allowed is for startups who have ideas to go to venture capitalists and say, hey, we now have a market. Because when they went to VCs prior to Frontier Climate being announced, the VC would say, where's the market? And now they have an answer to that question. So if I were king for a day, I would say, let's take all the areas where we need faster innovation and see whether an advanced market commitment or one of these other market shaping approaches would help accelerate innovation. And everyone knows about Moore's law, but there's a very important law for climate, which is called Wright's law. And Wright's law is what is the reduction in cost associated with a doubling in production volume that is associated with economies of scale and learning by doing. So what we need to do, you may have noticed that there is, certainly in the US, but many other countries as well, the price on carbon that the American political system can generate is zero. And so what that means we have to do is to figure out how to, as rapidly as possible, eliminate or at a minimum reduce the green premium and ideally create a green advantage so that the green and clean alternative is the profitable thing to do, not just the right thing to do. And what's the role for philanthropy? Philanthropy could help identify all the areas where we need to design a market shaping intervention, because we need to do this, I would argue, in cement, in steel, in chemicals, in fertilizer, in lots of areas where we need to accelerate the transition to a carbon neutral or even carbon negative economy. So market shaping is about what are those tools, and the target product profile is what do you want, right?
Yeah. You're reminding me, this might be a little tangential, but maybe not. I just did a conversation a week or two ago with Michael Liebreich, who's a renewable energy maven and investor. And we were talking about AI and this whole issue of mega demand for energy, which is changing the whole dynamic around how much you need to cut carbon.
Right.
And we were talking about, he had written a piece about the importance of these big AI-based companies not thinking about building their own generation, making it a closed system, but making sure they're part of the grid, that they're working with the grid to help facilitate broader community approval of what they're doing, which is a fight already in states like Virginia, but also functionally could lead to a better grid. And to me, the outcome there would be, if you have big actors willing to put up a lot of money to help foster grid capacity and resilience, that seems pretty great. But if they wall themselves off and just build a nuclear power plant that feeds their own plant, that's not so great. Is that something you think about?
Well, definitely. So there's an organization called the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance. And that's not a single firm trying to solve their own problem, but a consortium of firms that is coming together. And I think organizations like that can say, how do we solve this problem for the private sector overall, not individual companies each cutting their own bilateral deal. Having said that, one of the things that we want is clean, firm power. So we want clean, firm power that addresses some of the limitations of solar and wind, which is intermittent. And so I am happy when I see a company like Google step up to the plate and say, we are going to engage with an offtake agreement with a geothermal company not because it's the very cheapest form of power, but we have the ability to absorb that green premium and hopefully drive down the cost to the point where more and more people are willing to use geothermal either for electricity or for industrial heat. So yes, ideally that this purchasing power can be used in ways that help solve the problem for everyone. But I don't think it's a bad thing when Google raises its hand and says, we're willing to pay a premium for geothermal.
I get it. Well, this is a valuable conversation. There's a couple of good questions that are queued up that I'm going to bring in a minute. You had pointed me to a couple of other avenues that you're focused on, including, well, AI. We were just talking about AI in terms of
Yeah.
energy consumption, but AI obviously is front and center in so many areas right now. Where's the gap or opportunity there?
Yeah. One area that I'm particularly interested in is the relationship between AI and science. And that's an area where we're really beginning to see some breakthroughs. So, an example of this is that um, a team at Google DeepMind and David Baker at the University of Washington recently won the Nobel Prize for their advance in protein engineering and protein structure prediction. And one of the problems that we've made massive progress on that biologists have been working on for decades is if you know the amino acid sequence of a protein, can you predict what shape it's going to be? And that seems like it's really esoteric, but that's how we would develop protein-based therapies, is we'd know what the shape is and we'd know what the sort of lock and key relationship would be between multiple proteins or a small molecule in a protein. And so we had a database of 200,000 protein structures. In some cases, one of those was the topic of someone's PhD thesis. So they would devote their entire PhD to figuring out what the shape of one protein, one of those 200,000 proteins was. And what DeepMind was able to do, building on that massive contribution that took place over decades, was to develop a model called AlphaFold that allowed us to go from having 200,000 proteins to having 200 million protein structures.
Wow.
And I just met the CEO of an Indian biotech company who is building on that work. And he wants to be able to develop vaccines for 3 diseases, TB, Hep C, and Strep A. And if he is successful, that will save 1 million lives a year. So that's why this is a big deal. So the issue is that we sort of lucked in to this because the journal editors in this field of structural biology told the researchers, you don't get to publish your paper unless you deposit your protein structure in this database. And so we had this incredible high quality, open, diverse data set. Many fields, we don't have that, right? So if you talk to chemists, they'll say our data is behind a paywall. The only thing that is published is successful chemical reactions.
Right.
So our data is fundamentally unrepresentative. And if we knew that we were generating a data set for the purposes of training a machine learning model, we would do it differently. So there are all these areas where we could accelerate the pace of science, where we're not doing it because we haven't understood the preconditions for AI really being able to help us solve a problem and made the investments that we need. So why is this important for climate? The reason is that there are areas where we need innovation, number one. And do you know what the average time required to discover and make a new advanced material is? It's 17 to 20 years.
Yeah.
And so if we have these 2050 goals, my view is we don't have 17 to 20 years to discover new materials. So what we should be doing is investing in the computational and experimental tools that that massively accelerate the pace of science. And sometimes that requires creating these data sets, like the Protein Data Bank, requires investing in simulation software, or even something called a self-driving lab. What is a self-driving lab? It is where you have automated the process of doing a scientific experiment, and the machine learning is not only analyzing the data, it's informing what experiment to do next. So Sidney Brenner, who is a Nobel laureate in biology, made the point that a lot of times the reason that we make progress in science is because we discover new techniques. You think about, you had this picture of Galileo. Fundamentally, the scientific revolution was about telescopes and microscopes that allowed people like Galileo to look out into the solar system and say, hey, Aristotle and Ptolemy were very smart, but
Right.
but we can do better than they can, because we can see things that they were not able to see.
This is true. What you just said is very powerful, and it reminds me of some conversations I had with some young postdocs when I was at Columbia University. I did a webcast with them about how academia needs to evolve if it wants to have early career scientists tackle the tough questions of our time instead of just grinding out conventional papers.
Yes.
And there's something about the automation. Automation is not quite the right word. The expansions possible with AI that might potentially liberate young scientists, so they're not. But it would require these real systemic changes in how academia works. It's very disruptive what you're describing.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, they could spend more time on the design of the experiment as opposed to carrying out the experiment themselves, because
Right.
a lot of times there's a scientist we work with, Erica De Benedictis, and one of the things that motivates her to work on this is she just doesn't think it's a very good use of this highly skilled human labor to be manually pipetting small amounts of liquid from one vial to another.
Right. Right. But again, the norms in science, like if you're a taxonomist or a field biologist, you're trying to go out there to discover a new species. And I've talked in that, I've done webcasts in that arena with people who say, it takes so many years to do the taxonomic work to get a new species registered, when environmental DNA can show you what's out there in a sample of seawater, even though you don't have the thing right in front of you. But that's kind of a challenge to so many conventions.
Absolutely. It's why I come back to this point about the superpower of philanthropy is its flexibility, the ability to look at the world and say, what are we not doing that we should be doing? And what are we currently doing that we should stop doing? And there is growing philanthropic interest in an idea called metascience, which is, what if we applied the experimental method to how we fund research? So the dominant mechanism that we use to fund research is we use peer review, so committees of scientists, to allocate small grants to professors at universities for the purposes of supporting their graduate students and postdocs. And no one is suggesting that that's a bad idea and we should stop doing that. What they are suggesting is that there is a much larger landscape of institutional possibilities that we have not explored in any sort of systematic way. And so some of the projects that I'm the most excited about are mechanisms to fund, organize, and incentivize research that could accelerate the pace of scientific research and address some of these incentive problems that you mentioned. So I'm the chair of an organization called Convergent Research. You had a webpage up
Right.
earlier in the show,
Right.
and it's supporting focused research organizations. So these are teams of scientists and professional engineers who are in a nonprofit startup for science, and they're able to all row in the same direction. No one is worried about who is going to be the first author on a particular paper, or whether they have enough papers that are going to appear in Cell, Science, and Nature. They're just focused on a North Star. And again, I'm not saying this is the way we should fund research. I'm saying in the same way that we think about scientific and technological innovation, we also need to be thinking about institutional innovation, and that this is an area where philanthropy can have an impact by exploring some of these new models, and the models that work, will hopefully take off.
And it seems, well, someone could say, well, why isn't NSF doing that? And I remember they had, when I was at Columbia, the NSF was shifting some grant making to being, they had these different tracks where you could apply for these new kinds of grants. So it seemed to be more breaking molds. But you're saying philanthropy is better situated, or?
Philanthropy has the flexibility to do this, right? So I think, one of the problems with agencies, they have the ability to do this as well, right? But in a sense that they have a lot of people who are kind of relying on them to continue to support the status quo. Or, we may need to get 60 votes in the United States Senate. And so I absolutely believe that our science agencies should be doing this as well. So, for example, there's been this long-standing debate about should you focus on people or projects? And NIH did an experiment where they said, well, what if we took the people part, bet on people, and sort of cared less about the specific project that they were going to work on, but just bet on them because we think they're really smart and ambitious and creative, and gave them more autonomy. So there have been some of these experiments within the government as well, and I would say that incentive prizes are another example of an institutional experiment.
Yeah, I've been an advisor to a couple of X Prize tracks, and that again, that architecture does seem to make sense for certain kinds of challenges.
Yeah, it doesn't work for everything. I mean, it works for those areas where you have a finish line, right? So I worked on getting DARPA prize authority, and then ultimately every agency prize authority. The first time DARPA used that authority was for a series of self-driving car competitions. And there you literally had a finish line. So you have this obstacle course in the desert, and you have to develop a car that is fully autonomous and can complete the obstacle course. And if more than one team does it, they give it to the one who does it the fastest. And there are there are some instances in which we have a vague direction of that we want to head in, but we're not able to have this very clear outcome. But where we do, what I would love to see is a marketplace for outcomes that has three types of participants: the entity that's willing to pay, like Operation Warp Speed for the COVID vaccine. Second is the teams who believe that they can achieve that goal. And the third is the investors who are backing those teams. And one of the things I point out to any policymaker who will listen to me is that right now, the government has a widely utilized mechanism for making financial commitments that are contingent on failure. So if you were to examine the balance sheet of the federal government, you would see trillions of dollars of loan guarantees. Though that is the government saying, hey, Andy, if your company goes bankrupt, the US government will assume your debt obligations. So that is a financial commitment contingent on failure. What we almost never do is make financial commitments that are contingent on success. So again, if I were a king for a day, I would say, what are all the areas where we should use one of these approaches of saying, hey, if someone is able to do X, that would unlock so much societal value that, you know, the government is willing to pay for it.
That sounds, again, I think the thing you're pointing out here over and over again that I think is most important for anyone viewing this to take away is the flexibility and plasticity and relative lack of path dependency in the philanthropy community compared to all the structural realities in academia and government.
Yeah, no, they have more latitude, but I think here's another thing which I believe to be the case is there's a lot of billion-dollar bills lying on the floor that we are not picking up. In other words, there's lots of things that we are not doing that we should be doing, um, and it's because the incentives aren't right? So, for example, I talked about the revolutionary impact that the right data set is having on using AI and machine learning to massively accelerate the pace of scientific research. And so you could say, well, Tom, if it's such a good idea, why isn't it happening? Well, I'll tell you. Imagine you went to a VC and said, hey, will you give me $50 million? I want to use that money to create a high quality data set and then put it in the public domain. That would be a very short meeting because the VC would appropriately ask, how am I going to get my money back if you're planning on giving away the intellectual property? Why haven't academics solved this problem? What are academics rewarded for? Academics are rewarded for novelty. So they would get one publication by saying, hey, look, here's this new data set that I could create. The number of publications that they get would not scale with the size of the data set. So there are these things that we are not doing that we should be doing, right? And philanthropy, because of its flexibility, has the ability to say, well, why aren't we doing this? And what would it take? What catalytic role could philanthropy play in terms of getting this to happen? You're on mute.
That idea of leveraging or catalytic, filling the catalytic role is so important because you look at the budgets for federal science versus this is we're talking about a tiny little layer of cream on top of the bigger pie.
No, absolutely. And obviously there's much more private capital than there is philanthropic capital, but you see all the time venture capitalists not willing to support something because it's too early, it's a public good.
Mm-hmm.
The primary beneficiary are low-income families. They don't see what the business model is. It would be highly capital intensive. It would take a long time, right? So for example, if you talk to philanthropists, they will tell you as a general rule, they do not invest in the development of new antibiotics. Well, it's already the case that in sub-Saharan Africa, antimicrobial resistance is responsible for more deaths than HIV and malaria.
Wow.
So the response to learning that VCs will not invest in new antibiotics is not to say, well, I guess we can't have any new antibiotics then. It's to figure out a different strategy so that we do a better job of stewarding and managing the antibiotics that we already have, but that we have a plan for developing new ones. So policymakers and philanthropists need to understand what is in the anti-portfolio of the venture capitalist. In other words, what are they not investing that we desperately need? And what would it take to change that? Or alternatively, what is the the different capital structure that we would need in order to support innovation in these areas.
Great. I'm going to sneak in a couple of questions and observations. James Rosen over on LinkedIn, when we were talking about pandemic preparedness, he mentioned the website that I just want to show to people.
Yes.
It's called Ready Medicines to Prevent Another Global Crisis.
Yes.
I had not known about this, so I'm going to make sure to dig
great
in.
Initiative.
Thanks to James for that. There's a question from Deborah Stein. Says, what actions would Tom recommend to philanthropies, major S&T policy organizations, and others to support those who have lost jobs, fellowships, internships, etc., and those worried about their research funding due to Trump actions regarding DEIA, USAID, NIH, NSF, etc.? Is there the equivalent of a GoFundMe?
It's a great question. As I said, during the first Trump administration, there were significant budget cuts that were proposed by the Trump administration that were ultimately not supported by the Congress. And people who are interested in learning more about that history can go to the fantastic resource that the AAAS has on federal R&D and investment. But I realize that some of these actions are creating a lot of uncertainty. And I hope that obviously philanthropy is not in a position to fill every gap that will be created by the federal government. But I do hope that philanthropy can say, what are some things that philanthropy could do to help address some of these potential shortfalls.
For sure. And maybe the last one is Jeff Sukon on YouTube says, in this climate of Trump, do you really believe philanthropy without government help will alone help climate change abatement?
Well, I don't think there's a substitute for having public policies that are aimed at accelerating the transition to a carbon neutral and even a carbon negative economy. But I think regardless of what is happening on the policy front, I don't think the right reaction of people is just to curl up in a ball. It's to identify things that we can do. I had this whiteboard in my White House office, which had these aphorisms that we found useful, and one of them was, "It is better to light a single candle than cry out at the darkness." So that's what I always believe, is that yes, it's important to understand what's going on, but it's also important to identify concrete actions that we can all take that will move the United States and the planet as a whole in the right direction.
Well, that's probably a good place to end. And by the way, there's some science that's relevant. I'm actually doing a piece about this study. When autocratization is reversed, episodes of U-turns since 1900. Basically, they found that most autocratic governments lead to democratic twists. So there's social science that can actually is demonstrating the possibility of non-calamitous things ahead. So thank you.
Thank you
so much for your time.
It was great to see you after all these years. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, and come up to Maine. My mother-in-law's home, so I'm gonna call it quits. And let's do this again if there's some reason to. Just and anyone out there, this can be shared. The link you're watching on, share it when we're done. It's the archive version immediately as soon as we're done. This is Andy Revkin. This is Sustain What, which is my frequent, not always weekly, effort to identify progress pathways amid turbulence and conflict and divisive rhetoric and everything that's around us. Thanks to our guest today, Tom Kalil
Thank
from
you.
Renaissance Philanthropies. Take care.